Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining the stream from wherever in the world you're joining us from today. So, as you all probably know by now, my name is Rama Iyengar. I'm a developer advocate at the Cloud Foundry Foundation. So, we're doing a series of streams where I have invited folks from the Technical Oversight Committee. So, the Cloud Foundry Foundation is a nonprofit, and we have a governing board who we report to, but also a lot of the governance happens through the Technical Oversight Committee. Today, we have with us David Stevenson, who is a part of VMware officially full time, but is also an elected member of the Cloud Foundry Technical Oversight Committee. So we've been doing a series of streams where we've, just discussed everything Cloud Foundry, I guess, is a good way to summarize that. And so we've had all of these different folks share their experience about how they got into Cloud Foundry, how it's going for them, and really what they look forward to bringing to the ecosystem, to the technology itself, and to the community at large. So, like I mentioned, today we have David here with us to discuss that. So, hello, David. Welcome to the stream. And
Nice to
yeah,
be
do you
here.
want to, yeah, do you want
Sure.
to kick things off with a little bit of introduction?
Great. I've been in the Cloud Foundry community since about very end of 2012, beginning of 2013, when Cloud Foundry belonged to VMware, and it
Hmm.
wasn't part of the Cloud Foundry Foundation. And I was part of the transition for it moving its intellectual property from VMware to Pivotal and then going into the foundation. Worked on all kinds of parts of Cloud Foundry, from the original, helping to trim down the original 5 supported data services into a brokered API that built in large marketplace of available services. Gosh, I often empathize most with the operator persona, so you'll find me really interested in Bosch and the CPIs and all sorts of operator related things. But I get down into the container stuff. I do some container networking often from time to time. That's been quite fun for me. Yeah, I work full stack on Cloud Foundry very frequently. And I've been mostly a proprietary person. I think there's been a lot of folks at Pivotal and VMware who's been really interested in the open source, but I really wanted to branch out and get involved in the community a bit more. I saw some real potential there, and so I ran for the TSC and really tried to get myself more involved in the community. And what I do at VMware is I run sort of technical decision making for our tons of application services product based on Cloud Foundry. So I'm involved a little bit in every part of Cloud Foundry and the services APIs and so on. So I should hopefully know some amount about everything. And I would love to hear what other people want to talk about on this feed. If anybody has any questions and so on, weigh in.
Yeah, so before we begin, for folks who are watching us live, you can just drop your questions in the public chat. For YouTube, you could just tweet us at Cloud Foundry. So just if you have your questions, I'll make sure that David answers them. So, David, I just wanted to kick things off by. So, sorry, were you saying something?
No, not me. Saying,
Okay.
great, go ahead, Kit.
Okay. Yeah.
Start the
Yeah. I just
conversation.
wanted to kick things off with. Now you've described yourself as from the ops persona, and that's really very interesting personally for me too, because I sort of came in from the app development side. And so, what is it I wanted to ask specifically with regards to like day two problems that Cloud Foundry really eases for different software engineering teams?
Yeah, sure. I think day two problems, of course, breaks down into the 2 main personas. And since I love the operator persona, let's talk about the operator problems for a second, because the combination of Cloud Foundry and Bosch together solve, I think, some really exciting day two issues. And I think the VMware team in 2011, right, when very early in Cloud Foundry's history, invested in Bosch as a product, right, based a little bit loosely on Borg, because they came out of Google and they worked on Borg, and they're like, Borg was a really neat tool. that lets us manage fleets of VMs and kind of think about upgrades, think about availability and downtime during upgrades, and maybe even swapping operating systems and kernels and such with as little impact as possible. And so they said, let's invest, let's put a year or two of development into BOSH. I guess when I first saw that, I was like, this is interesting, but I don't think this investment's going to really pan out. And I'm excited that like BOSH turned out to be very useful for a whole bunch of different reasons. And the Cloud Foundry community leveraged BOSH. And so like, what does BOSH give us that on the day two side that's just really wonderful? Well, because it's like a self-contained packaging system, it's multi-operating system. You can actually like write a package that represents, I don't know, a Diego rep, and have that Diego rep run on Windows 2012, Windows 2016, Windows 2019, Ubuntu 16.04, Ubuntu 18.04, and Ubuntu like 14.04 or 12.04, whatever the one was before, and probably again on 22.04. So, and CentOS, it briefly ran on CentOS operating system. So BOSH is this great package system for authors to write the thing. It's not easy to write a BOSH package. So the barrier to entry is high, but once you get that, you get this like seamless compilation across all these different operating systems. And BOSH manages the like packaging part of the software for operators in a neat way. And then when it comes to like actually distributing and running the software, right? BOSH is declarative, and it attempts to converge the desired state of a deployment or cluster into the actual state with as little impact as possible, which is neat. And you see that in Kubernetes, other declarative systems, right? You don't really, like you kind of see it in Terraform maybe a little bit. And I think where BOSH and Terraform diverge, and where BOSH adds a lot more value than Terraform does, though it has a much smaller community, so that's not necessarily fair, is that like BOSH is cloud agnostic. You can declare a manifest, a deployment manifest of how you'd like a set of VMs and to be laid out and communicate with each other. And BOSH will make that work across 5 or 6 IaaSes to make that same deployment manifest work. You go to Terraform and you write out the resources you want for AWS, just throw that away when you go to Google, because none of that is going to carry over, right? The ideas are going to carry over. You're going to have to rewrite the whole thing from scratch. So this like multi-IaaS common denominator, I'm gonna swing that into a day two problem to bring it back to your question, Ram, which is like, what if you need to switch clouds tomorrow? What if Google gives you a better price than AWS or Azure or vice versa? How hard is it going to be for you to move clouds? And BOSH is this like really neat cloud agnostic deployment layer that makes it possible to move between clouds. And then above that, you have Cloud Foundry, which because it's deployed by BOSH, doesn't touch the infrastructure basically at all, which is the opposite of like the Kubernetes like cloud provider interface, right? Where you're like actually going to the IaaS to provision a load balancer at run dynamically. You're going to provision storage and mounting it in. You have a little bit of dependency on the IaaS at that point. We try to take that completely away with this like strong separation between the inner shell and the outer shell. And this gives you like a whole bunch of, I don't know, cross IaaS portability. It also like enables a disaster recovery story where BOSH handles the like resurrection of broken and dead VMs, right? That's a good day two feature to have. I kind of touched on the rolling upgrades, but canaries and max in flight are two amazing BOSH features that let a cluster deployment roll with as little impact as possible. And a canary will do a little test deploy, right? Let's roll one VM. And if that works, let's roll N at a time. And when that's all finished, you know, there's a combination of things rolling in serial and parallel, and links are passing information at runtime about the health of the system so that you can be routed to a healthy node. BOSH is like incredibly rich and powerful.
Right.
I think what we're not seeing with BOSH is a huge ecosystem. And that is sure disappointing to me. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But it is disappointing because I love the product and I wanted to see a huge ecosystem. And there was like a point where there could have been a huge BOSH ecosystem. And I think what made that really hard was that people couldn't write BOSH releases easily. I've got my RPM or my .deb package or my MSI.
Right.
And BOSH is like, step one, throw that away. Step one is to repackage and rewrite your software as a from source thing. And then step two is to build an operating system agnostic compile script where you're vendoring in a lot of the dependencies that you need. That's a really hard problem, right? Like we're willing to do that for some software, but the world isn't willing to do that for every piece of software that's out there. In the meantime, Docker images show up and say, here's a super easy way to kind of get your software packaged up it doesn't solve most of the problems that Bosch solves, but it's
Right.
really easy. And so like you're competing with, here's a really easy format to distribute your stuff in that might have a variety of day two problems that maybe we'll solve later, and like maybe it will be fine. But like it wasn't nearly as ambitious as Bosch, and it was much easier to use. So Bosch started losing market share to like that as a common packaging format, and then of course the operating system specific packages also. So
Right.
I've been talking about day two stuff for a while. I haven't really covered that much day two stuff. Any follow-ups on that, Ram?
No, but I think you bring up like a lot of interesting points. Um, some of the more technical ones I'll follow up with in a bit, but let's focus on the Bosch community aspect that you were mentioning. So, um, anything in particular that you see in terms of future efforts that we can take that can sort of change this, or is it too late? Has the ship sailed for Bosch?
I don't know. That's a great question. I don't think I actually know the answer to that yet.
Okay.
I suspect that we may be in trouble on the ship sailing for like building a strong Bosch community. I
Okay.
think, and I think I'll make an argument for why that actually could make sense. Like I think Bosch was attempting to be this common dial tone, right? And Bosch is
Okay.
like, I'm going to handle all sorts of complexity. I'm going to handle an underlying IaaS that can be swapped out. I'm going to handle packaging. I'm going to handle compilation. I'm going to handle deployment and day two operations problems. And I think what is actually happening is mostly people are starting to become aligned around the idea of Kubernetes as the common dial tone, right? And so if Kubernetes is a common dial tone, what value add that Bosch brings to the table, still makes sense in a Kubernetes world. Well, like the IaaS is now Kubernetes, which is this somewhat standard set of APIs and is provided by lots of different hyperscalers and other infrastructure providers. So that like cloud provider layer, we don't need anymore. Whether that's true or not in practice, we sure hope there's like convergence where different Kuberneteses look very similar.
Right.
In practice, you might get in trouble here, but like that's a vision that I think people can understand and hopefully push for more standardization and more tools across them to standardize. And so then you're like, well, what other value can of the Bosch-like world can translate over? There's like compilation and package management. Kubernetes is a pretty weak story on a lot of that. And so building like portable packages, collections of code that can be compiled at runtime and distributed as collections of source packages that can be built into essentially compiled releases like AKA Docker images. That doesn't exist in Kubernetes, but like the mechanism that people are using to solve that problem is hopefully closer to build packs. And right, it was always weird that like there was a build pack which compiled your application, and then you couldn't use that build pack in Bosch to compile your source code, which maybe was just an application, right? Maybe it's just a UA as a Java application, right? Can't run the Java build pack. I mean, we never tried to figure out how to take that compilation and package management plumbing from Bosch and Cloud Foundry and consolidate it and make it cross-usable. So I think Docker image is the future of a compiled package. What's the future of a source package? In Kubernetes, there's like analogies, right? There's like Carvel tooling, there's Helm charts, which has a little bit of packaging. There's just, I don't know, big collections of Docker images, which you have to relocate yourself. I think there's like a real lost opportunity there, and we'll fill those gaps. The Kubernetes community and ecosystem will fill these like packaging and compilation management, KPAC, et cetera,
Right.
gaps, some of which are involved in the Cloud Foundry Foundation, which is really exciting.
Right.
So I see that like Kubernetes is removing some of the value that Bosch added to the table. And then I see Bosch is not the right solution to re-adding that value. Like the right solution is a bunch of other stuff that with hopefully tells a good enough story where all of that value and all those lessons from Bosch can translate to the future. And so then what is Bosch left to be useful for is things that target virtual machines and infrastructure directly. And if Kubernetes plays out as a really successful technology, it's just like VMs versus bare metal.
Right.
You're like, how many things really need to go on bare metal? Like you say you need bare metal, And when VMs first came out, everybody said, I'm not doing this. It's too
Right.
unsafe. It's too whatever. It's too unperformant. And so this is just the next layer up of containers, right? The next abstraction
Right.
layer up. There's a lot of haters, and those haters will probably convert over. But in the meantime, or there'll be serious technological problems. I can't predict that for sure. But in the meantime, what we've got is Bosch is a pretty good tool as long as you follow all of its opinions for
Right.
deploying stuff if you really care about building something portable that works offline, totally self-contained, and can be deployed across lots of clouds with a lot of control over the update flow. I see a lot of that those ideas being moved to Kubernetes eventually, and then a really coherent Bosch-like story over there. And I think that story is just evolving. It's not ready yet, but it's getting there.
Right. A lot of things to unpack in that answer as well. But here's the thing. So you talk of Kubernetes and Bosch very close together, very converging in one tone, and sort of, pitted against each other in another tone. So what's sort of the deal there in terms of, the Cloud Foundry community is focused on both of these directions, sort of bringing the Cloud Foundry experience onto Kubernetes, and it's also focused on continuing to maintain and make sure that Bosch, works well, and can, solve all of these different problems. So, is the approach a two-pronged one for the community? And just could you share your thoughts about those things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it has always been a two-pronged approach, even though maybe people started to feel the story that we were all going to like just convert to Kubernetes one day, and like CFRKs or Quarks, any of the all these possible options were just going to be like one day you ran an upgrade and you were on Kubernetes. And I think what we realized is that it was going to be different onto Kubernetes. And so there was going to be two different Cloud Foundries, because they were going to behave significantly differently, such
Okay.
that you cannot wake up tomorrow, tell your developers, now everything's on Kubernetes. Don't worry, everything is going to be the same. All your apps are still going to work. Your logs are still going to be the same, and so on. Like the effort required to make it 100% identical such that people don't notice, the developers don't notice one day the operators have moved them to Kubernetes, is unrealistic, is going to be different. And so once you recognize that it's going to be a different Cloud Foundry on Kubernetes, that's a freeing thing. But it also breathes a lot of life into the virtual machine-based Kubernetes, because when it's different, now we're talking about how do people move over, and like when are they ready to move over, and when is it really mature enough for them to be ready, and when are they ready to take the fact that it is going to be different, and that some amount of applications aren't trivially going to work. Some people are going to have to be re-educated a little bit on the developer side. Yeah, you have tens of thousands of developers of Cloud Foundry using it. And so, the new Cloud Foundry strategy on Kubernetes is to get rid of a lot of the legacy technology as much as possible. So like we have a bunch of code bases. Those code bases are a lot of stuff in there, and there's a lot of Kubernetes equivalents or similar products. So if we try to keep all these code bases around, we're not really doing ourselves any favors. What we actually we care about is the API to Cloud Foundry, right? The API, and maybe as much compatibility as we can provide, as much as compatibility as is reasonable to provide, knowing that, where some number of things are not going to be the same. And like, that's actually a good thing. Maybe the way that Kubernetes does things is actually better, right? Maybe it's not that we're being difficult, that it's different. Maybe the ingress routing tier is more modern and has different characteristics than GoRouter does. Maybe that's a good thing, but it doesn't mean that your app is just instantly going to work for sure on a Cloud Foundry compatible Kubernetes distribution, right? But it does mean that like Cloud Foundry can trim its code down and be like a really relevant set of APIs on Kubernetes for anybody who wants those set of APIs. Are those the right set of APIs for a developer to use on Kubernetes to push applications? If you're familiar with them and you're enjoying them, yes. If you're unfamiliar with them, but you're familiar with Kubernetes very strongly, maybe not. Maybe if you're a strong Kubernetes developer, you would prefer to work directly with kubectl and like those manipulate the Kubernetes resources yourself. And if you're neither of those, I can't say, right? I don't feel like there's a strong Kubernetes platform for pushing applications that's really easy to use out there. And so maybe you go to the Cloud Foundry APIs because on top of Kubernetes because you view them as a really easy entry point. Though I think more and more of those will emerge that sort of offer competing experiences to the Cloud Foundry APIs on Kubernetes, but are more tailored to people that understand and want to use Kubernetes and get involved with Kubernetes over time.
Yeah, it is interesting to see a lot of different companies come forward, especially like smaller startups who provide the promise of a PaaS abstraction over Kubernetes that, just works, and just give us your source code and the keys to your IaaS kingdom, and then we'll, make it happen. And then when you read through it, they'll, in the messaging somewhere, it will say, oh, we use build packs, and oh, it's just like a one-line deployment. And there's like a handful of those tools right now, and they promise deployment to Kubernetes. And reading all of that, obviously to me, I come with like a biased mindset. Everything seems to point to the direction of, hey, this is what the Cloud Foundry folks are trying to do as well. So and because you mentioned this, I'm just wanting to go down that rabbit hole a little bit. So
yeah,
what is like the future for these um, PaaS endeavors in the Kubernetes space? And where do you see all of this like innovation and effort heading?
yeah, totally. We often think about like the value line, right? And like Kubernetes moves the value line up a little bit. And what I mean by the value line is like, what are you delivering that's commodity value that anybody has, everybody has? What are you delivering that's special, right? And sort of Kubernetes has moved the value line up a little bit, and everybody always like moving the value line up is a struggle for people who are providing that value below, and a real opportunity because the amount of effort required is smaller now. The total amount of value you have to provide, the amount of work you have to do to provide value is smaller than
Right.
it used to be. So like container scheduling was a value add that Cloud Foundry provided. That's a commodity value now, right? That's moved up.
Right.
And other things too, a little bit of on the ingress routing, a little bit on logs has moved up. So some of the like really core runtime components maybe are more commodity based. And so it's easier to build a PaaS on top of Kubernetes. Kubernetes is not a PaaS. Kubernetes is like a platform builder, a PaaS builder toolkit that you could use to build a PaaS, is how we like to think about it. And like that makes sense. So as the value line moves up, lots of players show up and try to build a business out of it. And so that's exciting. VMware's one of them. IBM's one of them. Everybody's excited about like there's big players, there's small players.
Right.
And this is true all the time. I think a lot of those are going to fail because they're not going to be able to differentiate themselves from each other very well.
Right.
And like at the end of the day, a lot of these companies need large enterprise spend in order to survive in the IT market. And so you have to figure out, how do you make yourself appealing to an enterprise company making buying decisions? Just a track record of consistent support and execution helps. But if you're a brand new company, you don't have that. So you're trying to figure out, how do I work in the small and medium-sized businesses? How do I compete on price, right? And competing on price sounds good, but eventually you're going to need to make enough money to survive too. And so you're like burning venture capital to compete on price. And there's a bunch of them doing it. Some of them will emerge, and that's exciting, right? It'll be fun to see who is able to build a viable platform on top of it. But there's a lot of choices out there. And a lot of enterprises are going to do what they did pre-Cloud Foundry, and they're going to build their own too. They're going to say, well, look at this value line. All we have to do is do this thing up here. And so it's incumbent upon all of us providers of platform experiences on top of Kubernetes to try to show people why they don't really want to do it themselves, why they would prefer to purchase a vendor solution, whether it's from a small or a large company, right? And it's like things like how do we do backports and security updates and support, and like what are the value adds you can do? Like what about a beautiful interface on top to teach people? Focus on the experience, try to market the experience. Because the experience, when you sell somebody on a set of outcomes and experiences, like we often do with Cloud Foundry, that can transcend technology relatively easily, right? It shouldn't be too hard to sell a customer on, you are getting this outcome X on technology Y. I'm going to continue to deliver you outcome X, but technology has moved. So now we're on technology Z. But like, you trust me to deliver you X. So I feel like it's my job to deliver you X, and we don't really care how that's getting delivered. So a lot of answers to a very short question, Rob. So this is my MO.
Sure. Yeah, I think the perspectives that you just shared are very, very interesting for me personally, because I'm getting into Cloud Foundry, starting to use it, starting to see the benefits and things like that. And it's not that I am thinking about it from a commercial angle too much, right? So it's about, here's what the technology is, here's what it can do for you, and here's how it can improve things, and um, so on. But yeah, to really balance out this perspective in terms of not just from the here's how, here's what, but also here's the commercial aspect of it, and here's a slightly more mature way to think of it. And those those perspectives that you share are really very valuable, to say the least, I guess. But just to know, think about what your role is in the TOC, and also building on some of the stuff you said, what is the CF vision for working with Kubernetes, or simplifying the Kubernetes experience in general? So what can we look forward to?
I'll answer this insofar as I know, but between like the two of us that are VMware members on the TOC, Eric spends much more time on this, so you should definitely ask him, and then you can,
Sure.
you probably already did, and then we can compare when you all talk, you compare notes, get us in different rooms, see how different our answers all are. I mean, I think our vision is to do our best to preserve the Cloud Foundry APIs and experience on top of Kubernetes by leveraging more Kubernetes ecosystem properties that like make more sense. And we're doing it via an indirection layer, which is slightly more expensive than doing it not via an indirection layer, but it's quite neat. We're essentially converting Cloud Foundry API requests into Cloud Foundry custom resource definitions in Kubernetes, and then realizing those Cloud Foundry CRDs with operators that convert them into actual implementations. And this allows the actual implementation to vary, right? Like the routes CRD can be realized by Istio or Contour or next generation routing thing that I haven't heard of yet that is about to come out, and so on. So like this indirection layer essentially lets us create a generic set of Cloud Foundry APIs that convert to a generic set of CRDs that don't have obvious instantaneous implementations, and then like creates a whole world of possible implementers for how to convert them, as well as some reference implementations so that you could get started. So hopefully it's not, you try this out and you're left with a bunch of CRDs that are fantastically sitting in etcd and no one is actually realizing them into any running applications. So that's the new vision. Maybe I'm talking really about the new implementation, not the new vision. But I think that's what we're trying to do, is to build something lighter weight on top of Kubernetes that will live for a really long time, compared to trying to lift and shift Cloud Foundry exactly as it is onto Kubernetes. Because I think that play comes into increasing friction over time, right? As Kubernetes has more things that like do same thing, but not quite the same, and you're not leveraging them, then you're left with how do you move Cloud Foundry to Kubernetes and then slowly swap out each of the components into something that makes more sense in the Kubernetes ecosystem?
Right.
And that sounds good, but each one of those swaps is both expensive to implement and disruptive. So it's probably better to batch up that disruption and do those swaps all at once, right? And like we may not be able to provide all the APIs, we may not be able to provide all the same set of compatibility, right? But hopefully we provide enough so that developers who are familiar with Cloud Foundry can continue to use it even in a Kubernetes context for the foreseeable future, not to mention the fact that the virtual machines-based Cloud Foundry is still being worked on and added
Right.
to also for the foreseeable future.
Great. Yeah. I mean, I'll definitely go back and compare the answers with Eric's, but I think again, like I mentioned, we really value varying perspectives, and it's important that everybody comes together with like different perspectives on solving the same problems essentially, and I guess that's how we make a wonderful community. And one of the other very specific things, I'm just changing tracks a little bit to also ease some of these questions that we're getting from the audience, is could you speak a little bit about your experience with the build packs project, both old and new, I guess?
Totally. I never worked on build packs, but I used build packs, and I used Heroku before it was Heroku Garden. So I go way back in Heroku. I built a competing product to Heroku where you gave your Subversion URL and we checked out your Rails application and we spun up an EC2 instance and we put your Rails app on it. That's how old that I am here in this space. And man, supporting all these different languages, right? The Heroku challenge of, they were like, how are we going to support all these different languages? We should really invent an abstraction layer so that we don't have to support any of them and we support all of them at the same time. And so build packs are just like such a great idea. And the fact that they run in the container means they can be untrusted. So you get to use your own, unless your operations team says, sorry, we want control over what kinds of apps you're pushing, languages and such, which many should, because I don't want a bunch of apps that I don't understand as an operator sitting on the platform and don't know how to monitor for vulnerabilities and so on, right? But it's a great idea. And I'm so glad we switched over. I was there when we switched over to build packs in Cloud Foundry. And like, that was such a good decision over us sort of rolling our own. And then the version 3 build packs, we call them, these cloud native build packs in Paketo and Kpack, so much better conceptually, architecturally than version 2. They were like, let's take these super complicated build packs that do like, the Java build pack is so big and it handles everything from like, what JVM you're using to what, what like servlet server, I don't know Java that well, what layer that actually serves it out to, like how you manage your libraries, how you do your build, like I'm going to say words like Maven and Gradle and Ant, but I don't know those things. To like installing a New Relic agent if you need it, like to third-party vendor stuff, they're like, let's take each of those and make them layers and let you build arbitrary composition of layers such that you could swap layers out. Oh, I don't like the Open JVM, I'm going to swap it with the Sun JVM layer. I don't like the Tomcat layer, I'm going to swap it with the whatever layer. I don't need the New Relic agent, let's get rid of that layer, right? Like, so it took these build packs and it broke them down into layers. What we are thinking about, whether it's possible to do now, is can we take this layered approach and put it back into Cloud Foundry, like for VMs, Cloud Foundry's general build pack interface. What does it take to jam those layers? They'll probably have to be pre-composed because that's what Cloud Foundry expects. But what does it take to rebuild the build packs as compositions of those cloud native build pack layers? And we're looking into it. There's some folks in the community who are deciding whether they're really excited about drafting a proposal. I'm hoping they're going to draft a proposal that when we switch operating systems to the next version of Ubuntu, we have to redo all the build packs whenever we switch container file systems. And stuff doesn't work and so on. Some stuff does work, most of it still works. But is that the right time to offer the cloud native build pack shims? And that depends on whether we can shim them effectively and whether the timing works out. But if it is, I'm really excited because those cloud native build pack layers are going to have a little bit more attention and evolution as time goes forward, because they're going to be part of an even broader community. And if we can bring that community back into Cloud Foundry, then like we get to leverage all these really cool build pack technologies for the foreseeable future as well, without having to kind of do double build pack development, right? super excited about that. I don't know if it's going to work out though. I'm waiting to see if we can get a proposal together, and then where people think that's actually a good idea. It won't quite be the same, right? These newer build packs will probably behave differently, and so it'll create some friction to switching applications. At some point, applications are going to have to upgrade to those new build packs if we do
Right.
this, and they might break because they're a little bit different, right?
Yeah, I think the most common sort of objection, I would say, when I go and speak about build packs to different folks is they have no problems using it on new projects. They're very excited to try it out. They're very happy with the results.
Yeah,
But then getting them to use build packs on existing projects or older projects, I think that's a huge challenge still, right?
because they already have a build system that's like emitting
Yes.
like a
Yeah.
executable, something that's like basically ready to go.
Yeah, and that sort of ties into this question that we have from the audience. So Alper, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, is asking, I am actively using Cloud Foundry as a developer. I think it's already super easy to use as long as you have the infra. Um, but maybe buildpacks approach may require some rework, in my opinion. Instead of creating custom build packs for developers
Mm-hmm.
who need customizations, they should basically deploy it with Docker, right? That's
Because
the
of the
question.
like layers. Yeah, like let me tell you why you don't want to just have everybody go start building Docker images and pushing them. Because that sounds really attractive. Let me tell you who it's not attractive for is the operations team, who has this like pool of Docker images that's running. They have no idea what's going on inside of them anymore, right? They've lost visibility into what those things are, what they're written in, what they're exposing. Like this is why Kubernetes as a PaaS, where everybody does whatever they want and just pushes Docker images to Kubernetes, is not a PaaS. It's a bit of a disaster, right? Like you're missing this layer of supply chain knowledge, understanding, security, right? Like how do those things come into play? How do I know you're using a version of the JVM that isn't vulnerable? You don't. Like it's all wrapped up. Maybe you can scan these images, right? The best play at that point is container image scanning, but that's a weak attestation to supply chain composition.
Right.
So like this is a disaster in the same way that like we talk to operators. We talk to operators and we're trying to sell them Cloud Foundry, and we say, what do you have right now? And they say, oh, I have a bunch of VMs and they're running stuff and I don't know what they are. And I have to
Right.
keep those VMs alive. And if I want to shut down this data center, I have to like move those VMs somewhere because these VMs are not recreatable, right? They're not auditable. Nobody knows they're could or could not be very important, and so on. And so like Cloud Foundry provides a lot of that. And I think you want to leverage build packs because you want to get out of the business of keeping your Docker image compliant and up to date and free of CVEs, right? Like that becomes your responsibility, developer, if you don't use the build pack, versus it becomes the build pack's responsibility to decide to offer you only stable supported versions of things. Now, if you're writing your own build pack, you're already off the rails a bit, right? If you're writing your own build pack, now you are taking that responsibility on
Right.
because there is no build pack out there for you that works. My question to folks who are in that situation would be, why are you doing that again? Is it that we don't support the language that you're interested in, which is interesting feedback? Maybe we need to support different languages.
Correct.
Is it that you don't like a decision we made in the build pack? And if so, would this layered build pack approach be of benefit because you can swap just one layer and keep the vast majority of everything and change a decision at the last second? For folks in that situation, I recommend looking even at the Cloud Foundry multi-build pack system, where you can still take a regular build pack and then put one thing on top of it, and maybe you can like reverse a build pack decision and then use an existing build pack, just so you aren't left with the responsibility of thinking through all the decisions. So I don't know what situation you're in where you're writing your own build pack, but hopefully most people are not in that situation, in which case I think build packs do add a ton of value on top of a regular Docker image.
Yeah, I think that's a rather comprehensive answer. Yeah, hopefully Alper, your question was answered. Thank you, though, for posting. So let me sort of move on, David, to some of the community aspects. So sorry, I'm jumping back and forth here, but
Yeah, I'm here to answer all things. Do it.
So in terms of finding new ideas and thoughts and folks, we're always looking for first time contributors to come forward and share whatever experience they have, whatever expertise they have, and whatever they can add in terms of value to what we are already thinking about and trying to do. So any message for first time contributors?
Absolutely. First of all, whoa, we did not make this easy for you. If you had been interested in contributing to Cloud Foundry for the lifespan of me being on Cloud Foundry, we did not make this easy for you. And I'm sorry about that. Like, I think I remember when we said the way to make contributions to Cloud Foundry is to join engineering teams building software full time. And you can't just join that team. You have to essentially almost interview to join that team. You have to come on site and work with us for 6 weeks. And then you go off and you join that team and you stay part of that team. You have to be basically full time on that team. That might work for large vendors collaborating together. And we had some strong vendor participation for quite a while. So it was possible to make that work for large vendors who are really committed and they know they want to make large contributions to Cloud Foundry to get what they're interested out of it, to build credibility with customers in the community that they care about Cloud Foundry, et cetera. And then we didn't cater at all to small scale contribution. So that is probably not the right way to run an open source project. And we realize that, obviously, and we're going through a transition and we're getting close to done with that transition where we make it easy for people to contribute small things. And so we adopted the Knative roles, or some of the roles out of the Knative community about like what's a working group as a collection of related project, code bases. And there's roles in working groups, and there's roles for very part-time contributors who just want to send a PR. We're going to make it very easy for you to send PRs. We're going to make sure everyone's using PRs, for example, so that like even people working full-time in an area very strongly are using PRs. So everyone can kind of see each other's contributions as equal. And if you're interested in contributing to our container scheduler, to our API system, to our logging system and router and whatnot, these are relatively large code bases, but they can be understood. They'll have contributing guides. Most of them already have getting started development guides. You can set them up. You can make small PRs to make tiny changes. And we'll, as approvers and leads and working groups, we'll make sure they get reviewed and you get feedback on them. So we're trying to make it easier for you to make contributions to this. I think where the Cloud Foundry architecture, so there's the Cloud Foundry process that we used before, and made it difficult to contribute in a part-time way and not like full-time serious. I'm all in on this all day way. The Cloud Foundry architecture also makes it a little bit difficult to contribute, as in these components are fairly large. Maybe that's not true in Diego, maybe in logging where there's lots of little components. But in most of Cloud Foundry, there's fairly large components that do a job, and that job is coupled to other jobs. It's kind of this like monolithic distributed system where these components are not small and they're not designed to work independently and solve one problem. And so what we see, I'm going to say word Kubernetes again, what we see in Kubernetes is like the evolution of lots of small tools that solve little problems. That actually also encourages contribution. And so I don't think we're going to be able to trivially re-architect Cloud Foundry to use lots of little things. But if you look at the trend of Cloud Foundry architecture, it has been to decompose those monoliths, at least into smaller things. Take the Bosch code base, separate out the CPI, separate out the agents, separate out the blob store management. Like we're trying to separate things out of the code bases to make smaller tools so that if you really want to change the way Bosch talks to S3, it's a very small code base and you can just try to wrap your head around it and make a small PR to it. If you want to make a wide sweeping change to the Cloud Foundry API, you're still stuck with Cloud Controller next generation, which is very large and so on. So there's areas where it's hard to make a contribution architecturally. We'll help with that a little bit, but I think we've all learned a lesson from that too, which is large code bases are hard for part-time contributors, large code bases that are highly coupled to other things, make it hard for part-time contributors to jump in and
Naturally,
contribute.
yeah. So, sorry if I cut you short, but
I'll talk forever, so do please cut me short.
um, but it seems like one of the things that has been a characteristic, and I don't mean to judge Cloud Foundry, the technology, or the community on that, but it seems like a lot of the paths have led to larger teams and sort of enterprise size teams, and those kind of folks to attach themselves mostly with Cloud Foundry. I think it's because Cloud Foundry, let's say, required 50 VMs, like Bosch required 50 VMs to run, And then we're also looking at this old Dojo model that we had that was really only affordable for large teams. And so it's probably not an intended consequence, but it looks like the smaller teams and the startups and the um, um, so that kind of engineering so teams where person hours are really short have not made it to sort of very regular contributors to the ecosystem. So I just wanted to ask you about, and you did mention that it's changing. You're inviting sort of that persona to come forward and contribute and make things easier for them. So I just want to understand, according to you, how important small teams and startups are for the ecosystem and for the technology, and any thoughts that you might have there.
Yeah, that's right. And I think you are right in your analysis of the situation historically, which has been that we haven't focused on these personas. We've said there's nothing stopping these personas, but then what's stopping them is the fact that the footprint is quite large, right? And so on. And so we made some progress in there. CF dev or there was a desire to enable easy development experiences on Cloud Foundry, even for our own usage, ignoring the small team or a medium-sized, company usage. We found it useful to do that. I think there's variants of CF deployment that are smaller resource footprint and so on. But you're right, we didn't optimize for it. We didn't make a coherent effort as a community to try to capture that market. And I feel like those companies and small developers who are looking at the ecosystem now are going to be pretty unlikely to be very excited about Cloud Foundry. I think maybe if they like the Cloud Foundry experience and were able to make a really good shim on the Cloud Foundry, Kate's side, they might install that on top of their Kubernetes cluster and say like, oh, I want to try this CF push thing, because what it looks like to push an application on Kubernetes right now, it involves like a lot of steps and a lot of like kubectl applies with a bunch of resources and a bunch of dependencies and so on. It sure would be nice if I could like get a CLI and run CF push easily as a developer. So maybe we'll capture them there. I don't see them as being really attracted to Bosch, because I don't see them as wanting to deploy VMs to speak of, period, right? Ideally, they are happy with the maybe weaker day two story that Kubernetes provides and less maturity, because they probably don't need that maturity. And maybe they're just running like a Minikube or a Kind cluster on their laptop and so on, and just trying to get it to work there. In which case, we always had the vision that Cloud Foundry would work with Bosch Lite. Like we did try a bunch of things. It's just those things didn't work in a production context ever. So when you got to production, it was always going to be expensive in Cloud Foundry. I remember when I joined, Bosch itself was 5 VMs.
Okay.
I was like, what's going on here? You have 5 VMs or 4 VMs or something like that for Bosch. And they're like, oh, but there's like a message bus and a database and a worker and an API server and a blob store. We'll put them on different VMs. And then there was some story about for high availability or something. I was like, no. You need all 5 of those VMs to do your job. You just made lower availability by taking these things out and separating them. So we at least got Bosch down to 1 VM, right? And VMware makes like a version of TAS of its Cloud Foundry deployment that runs on a smaller number of VMs, but we don't certify it for production use because we're not sure about the scaling problems and the day 2 issues you're really going to see. So from my perspective, Cloud Foundry remains mostly targeted towards that enterprise persona. to sum up everything, Cloud Foundry is still pretty much targeted towards that enterprise
Right,
persona.
right. Yeah, I mean, that's a fair, you know, answer in terms of solidifying the positioning and stuff. But I mean, I also like the fact that you mentioned that there's, for the newer um, CF for Kate's experience, there's probably some more takers who are not from that person. So, but only I guess time will tell. Um, Now, yeah, I just wanted to move to like closing comments and things like that, but I also wanted to address some of the other concerns that generally come up during conversations, which are more like so Cloud Foundry is obviously making a big push and a rather significant pivot towards supporting an experience on Kubernetes. Um, and then we've seen like kubecf happen in the past couple of years. We've also seen like a CF for Kate's approach. And then there seems to be insufficient traction. So there seems to be like I don't know, you have a new TOC, your ED resigns, and so a lot of people are a little wary about so the new stuff isn't there yet. um, and then will the old stuff continue to be supported? So does
Yeah,
Bosch have a
absolutely.
future? The
Yeah.
CFO, so what's the future? So just some closing thoughts to sort of alleviate some of these concerns would be great.
Listen, I hear these same concerns all the time in my role for the last many years, and my various roles
Yeah,
for the last
and
many years.
naturally, I
And
think the place where you hear it is sort of more commercially sensitive compared to like
sure.
my situation in
Yeah.
in a non-profit foundation. So,
Yeah, totally.
yeah, really happy to hear
Totally.
your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I will do my best to alleviate those concerns because I'm not particularly worried about this problem. And the reason I'm not worried about it is there are a large number of vendors that have real significant traction and real customer deployments on Cloud Foundry for VMs. And the move, as we learn more about the move to Kubernetes, we realize that it's going to be somewhat different for developers and very different for operators. But that's a good thing, probably. The difference for developers is semi-good thing. It involves changing the way they think about things a little bit, right? And so the move won't be trivial, and the maturity of the platform on the Kubernetes side isn't ready for them either. So what we have is a world where the virtual machines Cloud Foundry needs to continue to exist and evolve for much longer maybe than we originally anticipated. Like if we could successfully make a play to just move people over to Kubernetes and they didn't notice one day, then we would, and everybody would be happier because there wouldn't be this divergence of technology stacks, which creates expense. These vendors, that are working on Cloud Foundry, including VMware especially, are happy to continue to support that, and we're getting a lot of value out of open source Cloud Foundry on the virtual machine side. We will continue to enhance and support Cloud Foundry on the virtual machine side because it's in our interest, it's in our customers' interest, and they aren't asking to move over to Kubernetes anytime soon either. They're evaluating Kubernetes. They're interested in Kubernetes. They'd like to hear about what the story is going to be for Kubernetes. They'd like to try it, but they're not anxious to move production workloads over to a Kubernetes platform. So we still have time to develop a Kubernetes platform that speaks Cloud Foundry, and the value of that is that you're going to see an easier transition for those developers who are used to Kubernetes Cloud Foundry, of which there are tens of thousands. So we would like to aid that migration someday, if and when people feel like they're ready for it, and we're not going to push them over to it. So that's been our strategy. What about all these competing Kubernetes implementations of Cloud Foundry? What is the story there? Well, when you're talking about adopting a new platform, a new technology, a new underlying technology set, right? You essentially, we literally have three options, and we are now trying all of them, and we're going through them. We're iterating through option sets. It would have maybe been better if we had the right maybe long-term answer first, but the underlying Kubernetes ecosystem is evolving while we're doing this, and that's a very frustrating thing. So you're trying to target a moving object, right? So the kubecf option was literally lifting and shifting and try to leverage those Bosch primitives try to use something like Fissile so that no BOSH releases need to change. Like literally take the packaging and BOSH deployment style and move it over to Kubernetes. And I think there's just going to be way too much friction with how Kubernetes does things slightly differently and offers competing and or identical-ish solutions to each of those problems, so that doesn't really make sense. And then the next layer is like, move some of it over to Kubernetes and try to move a lot of the technology over, but not the deployment system. So at least drop the deployment system and use Kubernetes more as the native deployment system, but try to keep a lot of the Cloud Foundry technology. And that doesn't make sense as much either, because the ecosystem is evolving to supplant some of those technologies and those code bases. And so now you're trying to jam a code base in when you don't care about the code base, you care about the outcome that the developer is actually seeing. And so this third option, I think, is the best option. And we are investing heavily in it. So we're really excited to provide this Cloud Foundry compatibility layer, which is much smaller, much more K8s native, and lets the actual implementations of these concepts branch out into lots of different competing Kubernetes ecosystem opportunities there, because there is not one ingress controller that the community all agrees is the right one. There is probably not even one build system, though. KPAC and Pacato really has a lot of momentum. It's so exciting, and so on. There's not one supply chain manager. There's not one, and so on and so forth. There, logging system. So that's the future that I'm really excited about, is like preserving the Cloud Foundry CLI and experience for a developer, and really opening up the way that those are implemented on the back end to be real Kubernetes centric. And unfortunately, that does mean shifting focus from those other two competing implementation options. But that's a good thing, because you don't want 3 ways to move your Cloud Foundry experience over to Kubernetes. You'd like one supported, well thought through way. And so and each of those were supported and well thought through. I think they just ran up into significant architectural implementation problems that were going to mean they weren't going to be a good long-term solution to any of these problems.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes the space very interesting, to say the least, right? So solving sort of the same problem in different ways and coming at it and iterating over it, and pushing forward to a solution. And I think being a multi-organization open source tool, um, has that as one of the advantages. You get a lot of perspectives, and get to experience it through different technology cultures that are approaching Kubernetes in different ways. Some of the folks just want it right away. Some of the folks they're rather cautious, and they'd rather take their time, and there's they'd make the move only after they're absolutely sure. And so I think the crux of the issue, like you mentioned, is we still have time. There's time to figure this out, solve it well, and then present that solution out to the world. So thank you very much, David, for taking the time, and especially to share all of that information. And it's really a treasure trove inside your head in terms of Cloud Foundry experiences, for
I love Cloud Foundry. Been doing it for a long time. Super, and BOSH too, man. We can talk more about this, and maybe we will at some point, Ram.
we
But
definitely
it's
will.
pleasure to see you. Pleasure to see the community. Thank you so much for submitting questions. A few folks did. I suspect some more did who didn't get answered. Maybe Ram will send them to me, and then we'll strategize about sending out some answers or whatnot. But thank you for joining today.
Yeah, we definitely will. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. So we're signing off now. Watch out the Cloud Foundry Twitter space. So we're at Cloud Foundry on Twitter. So we'll be posting, our content updates over there. And there's more live streams to come. There's more, technical stuff, non-technical stuff, what have you, to make this Cloud Foundry experience so much more easier for you. So yeah, thanks, and have a great rest of the